In the heart of the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where marble corridors echo with centuries of whispered secrets and golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows on portraits of long-dead monarchs, a single piece of paper holds the power to shatter a dynasty. Palace Guard Captain Marcus Thornfield never expected his routine midnight patrol to uncover the most dangerous secret in royal history. When he stumbled upon Queen Consort Isabella frantically feeding documents into the ornate fireplace of her private study, he thought nothing of it until a gust of wind from an open window sent one unburned letter spiraling across the marble floor to land at his feet. The elegant royal seal was still warm from the flames, but the words written in Isabella's own hand were ice-cold. As Marcus read the devastating contents by flickering candlelight, he realized he held evidence that could destroy not just the queen consort, but bring down the entire monarchy. The letter revealed a conspiracy 20 years in the making, involving switched identities, hidden heirs, and a secret that made Prince Alexander's claim to the throne not just questionable, but completely illegitimate. Now Marcus faces an impossible choice: remain loyal to the crown that has employed his family for generations, or expose the truth that could plunge the kingdom into chaos. But, as dawn approaches and Isabella discovers her missing letter, Marcus realizes he may not live long enough to make that decision. In a world where knowledge is power and secrets are currency, some truths are worth killing for. What started as a simple act of duty is about to become a deadly game of survival, where palace walls hide more than just family portraits, and even the most trusted guardians can become the greatest threats to the throne. Captain Marcus Thornfield adjusted his ceremonial sword as he began his midnight patrol through the east wing of Valdoria Palace. The ancient stone corridors stretched endlessly before him, lit only by the soft glow of electric sconces designed to mimic the flickering candles of centuries past. His boots echoed against the polished marble floors, creating a rhythmic soundtrack that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past 15 years of service. The Thornfield family had served the royal guard for 4 generations. Marcus's great-grandfather had protected King Edmund II during the Great War, his grandfather had stood watch over Queen Victoria III during the rebellion of 1923, and his father had given his life protecting the current king during an assassination attempt 12 years ago. The weight of that legacy pressed heavily on Marcus's shoulders as he walked the same routes his ancestors had patrolled before him. Tonight felt different, though Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on why. The palace held an unusual tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes thick and electric. He had noticed it earlier during the evening shift change, when the usual chatter among the guards had been replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances. Even the kitchen staff seemed on edge, hurrying through their duties with unusual urgency. The recent weeks had been particularly stressful for everyone in the palace. Crown Prince Alexander's engagement to Lady Catherine Blackwood had been announced with great fanfare, but, behind the public celebrations, there were whispers of discord within the royal family. Queen Consort Isabella, who had married into the royal family 25 years ago, seemed increasingly withdrawn and anxious. The king himself appeared troubled during recent public appearances, his usual confidence replaced by a distracted demeanor that hadn't gone unnoticed by the press. Marcus paused at the grand staircase that led to the royal family's private quarters. The portraits of past monarchs gazed down at him with stern expressions, their eyes seeming to follow his movement through the shadows. He had always found these paintings both inspiring and intimidating. Each face represented generations of duty, sacrifice, and the burden of leadership that came with wearing the crown. As he continued his patrol, Marcus's mind wandered to his own family. His wife Sarah was pregnant with their second child, and their 5-year-old daughter Emma had recently started asking why Daddy had to work at night. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he protected the royal family, he spent less time with his own. But the salary was good, the position was respected, and the Thornfield name carried weight in certain circles because of their long service to the crown. The clock tower chimed midnight, its deep bronze tones reverberating through the palace walls. Marcus quickened his pace slightly, knowing he needed to complete his rounds of the east wing before moving to the north tower. The routine was sacred, unchanged for decades, with each guard following the same pattern their predecessors had established. As he approached the queen consort's private study, Marcus noticed something unusual. A thin line of warm light glowed beneath the heavy oak door, and he could hear the soft sound of movement within. It wasn't uncommon for members of the royal family to keep late hours, but Queen Isabella typically retired early, especially recently when she had been complaining of headaches and fatigue. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to continue his patrol or investigate. His training told him to be observant but not intrusive, to protect but not pry. The royal family deserved their privacy, and his job was to ensure their safety, not monitor their activities. Yet something about the situation felt off, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. He decided to continue past the door, but, as he did, he heard what sounded like papers rustling urgently, followed by a soft thud as if something had fallen. His protective instincts kicked in immediately. What if the queen consort had fallen? What if someone had broken into her private study? His father had always told him that a good guard trusted his instincts, and, right now, every instinct was telling him something was wrong. Marcus approached the door quietly, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. He listened carefully, trying to determine what was happening inside. The sounds continued, more rustling, the scrape of a chair being moved, and what might have been a drawer being opened and closed repeatedly. Through the keyhole, he could see movement and the dancing light of what appeared to be fireplace flames. The queen consort's study did have a working fireplace, one of the few rooms in the palace that still used the original stone hearth from the building's construction 3 centuries ago. But why would she have a fire burning on such a warm spring night? The sound of footsteps moving quickly across the room caught his attention, followed by more rustling papers. Marcus's concern grew. If Queen Isabella was ill or in distress, he needed to help. If someone had broken in, he needed to act immediately. Either way, his duty required him to investigate further. He knocked softly on the door, just loud enough to be heard but not so loud as to startle anyone inside. "Your Majesty? This is Captain Thornfield on patrol. Is everything all right?" The sounds inside the room stopped immediately, creating a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Several long seconds passed before Queen Isabella's voice called out, though it sounded strained and slightly breathless. "Everything is fine, Captain. I'm just reviewing some correspondence. Please continue your rounds." Something in her tone didn't sound right. In his years of service, Marcus had heard Queen Isabella speak countless times, both in public and in private moments when she didn't know guards were nearby. She was always composed, always regal, even in casual conversation. But, tonight, her voice carried a note of panic that she was trying desperately to hide. "Of course, Your Majesty. I apologize for the disturbance. Sleep well." Marcus stepped away from the door but didn't continue his patrol immediately. Instead, he positioned himself in the shadows near a large marble pillar where he could observe the study door without being seen. His instincts were screaming that something was wrong, and his father had always taught him to trust those instincts when it came to protecting the royal family. Several minutes passed before he heard movement again from inside the study. The sounds were more frantic now, papers being handled roughly, drawers being opened and slammed shut, and what sounded like books being moved quickly. Marcus wondered if he should call for backup, but he also knew that if this turned out to be nothing, he could face serious consequences for overreacting to the queen consort's late-night activities. Then, he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable noise of papers being fed into a fire, the soft whoosh as flames consumed documents. Why would Queen Isabella be burning papers at midnight in her private study? What kind of correspondence required such urgent and secretive destruction? Marcus knew he was treading on dangerous ground. The royal family's private affairs were exactly that, private. But, as a member of the royal guard, he had also sworn an oath to protect the crown from all threats, internal and external. If Queen Isabella was destroying evidence of something that could harm the monarchy, didn't he have a duty to investigate? The sounds from inside the study continued for several more minutes. Marcus could hear the queen consort moving around the room, occasionally muttering to herself, though he couldn't make out the words. The urgency in her movements suggested she was working against some kind of deadline, as if someone might discover what she was doing at any moment. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack as a window was opened, followed by a gust of wind that Marcus could hear rushing through the room. A moment later, he heard Queen Isabella gasp, followed by rapid footsteps and what sounded like her scrambling around on the floor. Then, the study door flew open, and Queen Isabella emerged, looking disheveled and wild-eyed. Her usually perfectly arranged hair was loose around her shoulders, and her silk robe was askew. She looked left and right down the corridor, and Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows behind the pillar. The queen consort was clutching something in her hand, what looked like a small piece of paper or a fragment of a larger document. She stared at it for a moment, her face pale in the dim light, before quickly stuffing it into the pocket of her robe. Then, she hurried back into the study and closed the door behind her. Marcus waited several more minutes, his mind racing with questions. What had Queen Isabella been burning? What was the paper she had recovered? Why was she so desperate to destroy whatever correspondence she had been reviewing? As he stood there in the shadows, a piece of paper suddenly appeared under the study door, sliding across the marble floor toward his hiding place. It must have been blown by the wind from the open window, escaping before Queen Isabella could retrieve it. Marcus looked around quickly to ensure no one else was nearby, then stepped forward and picked up the paper. It was high-quality stationery with the royal seal embossed at the top, though the wax seal was cracked and partially melted from the heat of the fire. The paper was slightly singed around the edges, and part of it was torn, but enough remained to read most of its contents. As Marcus read the letter by the dim light of the corridor sconces, his world shifted fundamentally. The elegant handwriting was unmistakably Queen Isabella's, but the words written on the page revealed a secret so devastating that Marcus immediately understood why she had been so desperate to destroy it. The letter was addressed to someone named Imar and dated just 3 days ago. It began, "My dearest friend, the time has come to reveal the truth we have hidden for 20 years. Alexander must never know that he is not the king's biological son. The blood test results you provided confirmed what we both suspected. The child we switched that night in the hospital was never returned to his true family." Marcus felt his knees weaken as he continued reading. The letter went on to detail how Queen Isabella had discovered, shortly after Prince Alexander's birth, that there had been a mix-up at the private hospital where she had given birth. Rather than admit the error and face the scandal of the heir to the throne being the wrong child, she had conspired with someone, presumably this Imar, to conceal the truth. But the most shocking revelation came in the letter's final paragraph. The DNA test proves that our Alexander belongs to the Miller family from the countryside. Their son, the true heir, was raised as Thomas Miller and died in that farming accident 5 years ago, never knowing his real identity. We can never let this truth surface, as it would not only delegitimize Alexander's claim to the throne but could destroy the entire monarchy. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each reading making the implications more clear and more terrifying. Prince Alexander, who was set to become king upon his father's eventual death or abdication, was not actually royalty at all. He was a commoner who had been switched at birth, while the true heir had lived and died as a farmer, completely unaware of his real heritage. The letter ended with what appeared to be instructions for someone to destroy certain medical records and eliminate any remaining evidence of the switch. It also mentioned that if anyone ever discovered the truth, both Queen Isabella and her accomplice would face not just disgrace but potentially treason charges. As Marcus stood there holding the letter, he heard Queen Isabella moving around frantically in the study again, presumably looking for the missing document. He quickly folded the paper and slipped it inside his uniform jacket, his mind racing with the enormity of what he had discovered. Every part of his training told him to return the letter immediately and pretend he had never seen it. His loyalty to the crown, his family's legacy of service, and his own position all depended on maintaining the royal family's secrets. But another part of him, the part that had sworn to protect the integrity of the monarchy, wondered if hiding this truth was actually a betrayal of everything he had pledged to defend. Marcus quietly retreated from the pillar and continued his patrol, his movements mechanical as his mind struggled to process what he had learned. The rest of the East Wing passed in a blur as he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. By the time he reached the North Tower, Marcus had come to a terrible realization. He was now in possession of information that could destroy not just Prince Alexander and Queen Isabella, but the entire royal family. The scandal would be unprecedented, a false heir raised to believe he was destined to rule, while the true heir had died unknown and unrecognized. But perhaps even more dangerous was the fact that Queen Isabella would soon discover that her letter was missing. When she realized what had happened, she would know that someone had evidence of her secret. And, based on what Marcus had read about eliminating evidence and the lengths she had already gone to hide the truth, he had to consider the possibility that she might be willing to go to extreme measures to protect herself. As Marcus completed his rounds and prepared to file his patrol report, he faced a decision that would change not only his life but potentially the course of the kingdom's history. The letter in his jacket felt like it was burning against his chest, a physical reminder of the secret that could either save or destroy everything he had spent his life protecting. The dawn was breaking over the palace grounds, painting the ancient stone walls in soft pink and gold light. Somewhere in those walls, Queen Isabella was probably still awake, wondering what had happened to her missing letter. And, somewhere else, Prince Alexander was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his entire identity might be built on a lie. Marcus knew that whatever choice he made in the next few hours would define not just his own future, but the future of the crown itself. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but it was a burden he would have to carry alone, at least for now. Marcus barely slept for the next 3 hours. When he arrived home to his modest cottage just outside the palace grounds, his wife Sarah immediately noticed his troubled expression. She was preparing breakfast for their daughter Emma, who would soon head off to the village school, but her attention quickly focused on her husband's pale complexion and distracted demeanor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said softly, not wanting to alarm Emma. "Rough night at the palace?" Marcus forced a smile and kissed his wife's forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender from her hair. "Just a long patrol. Nothing more exciting than checking locked doors and empty corridors." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but how could he explain to his pregnant wife that he was carrying a secret that could potentially put their entire family in danger? The letter remained hidden in his jacket, which now hung on the hook by the front door like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. Emma ran to him with her arms outstretched, and Marcus scooped up his daughter, holding her close. Her innocent laughter and warm embrace provided a momentary respite from the turmoil in his mind, but even as he helped her with her breakfast and listened to her chatter about her upcoming school play, part of his attention remained focused on the devastating knowledge he now possessed. After Sarah left to walk Emma to school, Marcus sat alone at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the palace towers visible in the distance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the carefully manicured grounds, and he could see the early shift guards taking their positions. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but Marcus knew that appearances could be deceiving. He retrieved the letter from his jacket and read it again, hoping that somehow he had misunderstood its contents in the dim light of the corridor. But the words remained unchanged, their meaning crystal clear. Prince Alexander was not the rightful heir to the throne, and Queen Isabella had been living with this secret for 20 years. Marcus tried to imagine what it must have been like for her all these years, watching an innocent child grow up believing he was destined to rule a kingdom, knowing that his entire life was built on a foundation of deception. The psychological burden must have been enormous, but that didn't excuse the conspiracy she had participated in. More troubling were the implications for the kingdom itself. If the truth ever came out, it wouldn't just affect the royal family, it would shake the very foundations of Valdoria's constitutional monarchy. The legitimacy of the crown depended on the unbroken line of succession, and a revelation that the heir was actually a commoner could trigger a constitutional crisis that might take decades to resolve. Marcus's contemplation was interrupted by a sharp knock at his front door. Through the window, he could see a palace messenger in full uniform, holding an official envelope. His heart began racing as he wondered if Queen Isabella had already discovered the missing letter and traced it back to him. The messenger was young, probably new to the position, and he seemed nervous as he handed over the envelope. "Captain Thornfield? I have an urgent message from the palace. You're requested to report immediately to Captain General Morrison's office." Marcus thanked the messenger and waited until he was gone before opening the envelope. The message was brief but formal. "Captain Thornfield, report to my office at 0800 hours for an urgent briefing regarding last night's security protocols. This matter requires immediate attention." Captain General Morrison. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Morrison was the head of palace security, a stern man in his 60s who had served the royal family for over 40 years. If Queen Isabella had reported something suspicious about her interaction with Marcus the night before, Morrison would be the first person she would contact. Marcus quickly showered and changed into a fresh uniform, carefully transferring the letter from his old jacket to his new one. As he prepared to return to the palace, he considered his options. He could destroy the letter and deny everything, claiming he had seen nothing unusual during his patrol. He could confess immediately and hope that his years of loyal service would earn him some consideration. Or he could try to verify the letter's claims before deciding what to do with the information. The third option appealed to him most, but it would also be the most dangerous. Investigating the claims in the letter would require him to access medical records, birth certificates, and other sensitive documents that were far beyond his security clearance. It would also mean keeping the secret longer, giving Queen Isabella more time to discover that the letter was missing and potentially take action against him. The ride back to the palace felt longer than usual, despite being the same route Marcus had traveled thousands of times before. Every guard he passed seemed to look at him suspiciously, though he knew this was probably just his paranoia manifesting. The letter felt like it was radiating guilt, making him visible to anyone who might be looking for signs of deception. Captain General Morrison's office was located in the oldest part of the palace, in what had once been the medieval fortress that formed the original structure. The stone walls were thick enough to muffle most sounds, and the narrow windows provided natural light but limited visibility. It was the perfect place for sensitive conversations that required absolute privacy. Morrison was waiting behind his massive oak desk when Marcus arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. The older man's expression was unreadable, his weathered face showing no emotion as he gestured for Marcus to take a seat in the chair across from him. "Captain Thornfield," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in military service. "I trust you understand that what we discuss in this room must remain completely confidential." "Of course, sir," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus carefully. "Tell me about your patrol last night. Specifically, your rounds through the East Wing between midnight and 1 o'clock. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This was it, Queen Isabella had reported their interaction, and now he would have to decide how much truth to reveal. "I completed my standard patrol route, sir. I checked all secured areas and found everything in order." "Did you encounter any members of the royal family during your patrol?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Marcus knew that lying to Morrison would be a serious offense, but telling the complete truth might be even more dangerous. "I briefly encountered Queen Isabella near her private study. She was awake and informed me that she was reviewing correspondence. I apologized for any disturbance and continued my patrol." Morrison nodded slowly. "And, during this encounter, did you observe anything unusual about the Queen Consort's behavior or demeanor?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "She seemed tired, sir. Perhaps a bit stressed, but nothing that appeared to require immediate attention or intervention." "I see." Morrison made a note on a piece of paper, then looked up at Marcus again. "The Queen Consort has reported that some private documents may have gone missing from her study last night. She's concerned that they may have been inadvertently misplaced during what she described as some late-night organizing of her personal papers." The implication was clear. Morrison was giving Marcus an opportunity to come forward about the letter without directly accusing him of theft. But it also confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Queen Isabella had discovered that the letter was missing, and she was actively looking for it. "I didn't observe any documents during my brief interaction with Her Majesty," Marcus said, technically telling the truth since he hadn't taken the letter directly from her possession. Morrison studied his face for a long moment before continuing. "These documents are of a highly personal and sensitive nature. Their contents could be easily misinterpreted by someone without proper context. If they were to surface inappropriately, it could cause significant embarrassment to the royal family." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Morrison's words seemed to carry a subtle threat: return the documents quietly, and the matter would be forgotten, continue to possess them, and face serious consequences. "I understand completely, sir," Marcus replied. "If I become aware of any missing documents, I'll certainly report it immediately." "I'm sure you will, Captain." Morrison closed the file on his desk and stood up. "There's one more matter we need to discuss." Due to some upcoming security changes, you're being temporarily reassigned to day shift duties in the public areas of the palace. Effective immediately. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Being moved to day shift public duties was essentially a demotion, a clear indication that he was no longer trusted with access to the royal family's private areas. It also meant that he would have much less freedom to investigate the claims in the letter or to take any action based on its contents. May I ask the reason for this reassignment, sir? Administrative purposes, Morrison replied curtly. Your new supervisor will brief you on your duties. That will be all, Captain. Marcus stood and saluted, then left Morrison's office with his mind spinning. The reassignment confirmed that Queen Isabella suspected him of taking the letter, but it also suggested that she wasn't entirely certain. If she had been completely sure, he would probably be facing arrest rather than just a transfer. As he walked through the palace corridors toward his new assignment, Marcus noticed several things that hadn't been apparent during his night shifts. The daytime palace was bustling with activity, servants, administrators, security personnel, and various officials moving through the halls with purpose. But, more importantly, it was also filled with visitors, dignitaries, and staff members who had access to areas and information that night shift guards never encountered. His new supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, was a pragmatic woman in her 40s who had worked in palace security for 15 years. She briefed Marcus on his new duties, which primarily involved monitoring the public areas where tourists and official visitors were allowed access. It's not glamorous work, Barnes explained as they walked through the palace's public galleries, but it's important. These areas see thousands of people every week, and maintaining security while preserving the welcoming atmosphere requires constant attention. As Barnes showed him around his new patrol areas, Marcus began to see possibilities he hadn't considered before. The palace's public areas included several administrative offices, a small museum, and the official records office where visitors could access certain historical documents. More importantly, some of the staff members working in these areas had been at the palace for decades and might have knowledge that could help him verify the claims in Queen Isabella's letter. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who managed the palace's historical archives, had worked there for over 30 years. She greeted Marcus warmly when Barnes introduced them, commenting that she remembered his father from his years of service. Such a tragic loss, Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes growing misty. Your father was a good man who truly cared about protecting this institution. I hope you've inherited his sense of duty and integrity. The comment hit Marcus harder than he expected. His father had indeed been a man of unwavering integrity, someone who had ultimately given his life to protect the royal family. What would his father have done in this situation? Would he have quietly returned the letter and allowed the conspiracy to continue, or would he have felt obligated to ensure that the truth came to light? Throughout his first day on the new assignment, Marcus found himself observing the palace staff with new interest. These people had dedicated their lives to serving the crown, just as he had. They believed in the institution they were protecting, and they trusted that the royal family deserved their loyalty and sacrifice. How would they react if they learned that Prince Alexander's claim to the throne was fraudulent? During his lunch break, Marcus sat in the staff cafeteria and listened to the conversations around him. Several employees were discussing Prince Alexander's upcoming engagement ceremony, expressing excitement about the celebrations and speculation about future royal children. Others were talking about recent palace renovations funded by taxpayer money, or the various charitable causes supported by the royal family. The disconnect between these conversations and the knowledge Marcus carried felt almost surreal. All of these people were living and working based on the assumption that the monarchy was legitimate and that Prince Alexander was the rightful heir. If the truth in Queen Isabella's letter ever came to light, it wouldn't just affect the royal family, it would devastate everyone who had built their lives around serving the crown. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself walking past the records office several times, trying to work up the courage to investigate further. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned that birth records for royal family members were kept in a special secured section, accessible only to senior staff with proper authorization. But she had also mentioned that the filing system included cross-references to hospital records and other supporting documents that might contain the kind of information Marcus needed. The risk of getting caught investigating these records was enormous, but so was the risk of doing nothing. If Queen Isabella was willing to destroy evidence and potentially eliminate anyone who threatened her secret, Marcus might already be in danger simply by possessing the letter. His only protection might be to gather enough evidence to prove the letter's claims, giving him leverage in case she decided to take more drastic action. As his shift ended and he prepared to return home, Marcus made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of the crisis. Instead of leaving the palace immediately, he found an excuse to return to the records office, claiming he needed to verify some information for his shift report. Mrs. Henderson had already left for the day, but the office remained accessible to security personnel for emergency purposes. Marcus used his security code to enter the office, his heart pounding as he made his way to the filing cabinets that contained historical royal documents. The files were meticulously organized, with separate sections for different types of records. Marcus located the section containing birth and medical records, but found that the files for Prince Alexander's birth were sealed in a special container that required a higher security clearance than his own. However, the cross-reference files were accessible, and Marcus quickly found references to St. Mary's Private Hospital, where Prince Alexander had been born 25 years ago. The reference included a file number and a notation about special security protocols surrounding the birth. More importantly, Marcus found a separate file containing correspondence between the palace and the hospital from the weeks following Prince Alexander's birth. Most of the letters were routine, thank you notes, payment confirmations, and requests for medical records. But one letter, dated 6 weeks after the birth, caught his attention. The letter was from Dr. Margaret Reeves, the attending physician during Prince Alexander's birth, to the palace's chief medical officer. It mentioned concerns regarding patient identification protocols and requested a meeting to discuss procedural irregularities that occurred during the royal birth. Dr. Margaret Reeves, M.R. The initials matched those on Queen Isabella's letter. Marcus quickly photographed the letter with his personal phone, then carefully returned the file to its proper location. As he left the records office and headed home, his mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. The letter from Dr. Reeves suggested that there had indeed been problems with patient identification at the hospital during Prince Alexander's birth. Combined with Queen Isabella's letter mentioning blood tests, DNA results, and a switched child, the evidence was beginning to paint a clear picture of what had happened 25 years ago. But Marcus also realized that he was now in possession of information that made him extremely dangerous to Queen Isabella and anyone else involved in the conspiracy. If Dr. Reeves was still alive, she would be another person who knew the truth about the switched children. The letter had mentioned eliminating evidence and remaining witnesses. Was Dr. Reeves in danger too? As Marcus drove home through the gathering twilight, he knew that he could no longer simply decide whether to return the letter or report its contents. He was now actively investigating a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the monarchy, and there was no way to undo the knowledge he had gained. The question was no longer whether to act, but how to act in a way that would protect both the truth and the innocent people who might be caught in the crossfire when the scandal inevitably exploded into public view. Dr. Margaret Reeves lived in a quiet cottage on the outskirts of the capital city, about an hour's drive from the palace. At 73 years old, she had been retired from active medical practice for 8 years, but her reputation as one of the kingdom's most skilled obstetricians had never faded. She had delivered 3 generations of Valdorian nobility, including several members of the royal family, before stepping back from the demanding profession that had defined her life. Marcus had spent 2 days researching Dr. Reeves before deciding to approach her directly. Public records showed that she had never married, had no children of her own, and lived alone since retiring. She maintained a small garden and occasionally volunteered at the local clinic, but otherwise kept a low profile that suggested someone trying very hard not to draw attention to herself. The cottage was exactly what Marcus had expected, neat, modest, and surrounded by carefully tended flower beds that spoke of someone who had found peace in simple pleasures after a lifetime of high-pressure work. As he knocked on the front door, Marcus felt the weight of Queen Isabella's letter in his jacket pocket and wondered if he was about to destroy this woman's carefully constructed quiet life. Dr. Reeves answered the door after several minutes, moving slowly but with the alert posture of someone whose mind remained sharp despite her advancing years. She was smaller than Marcus had expected, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his appearance in a single glance. "Dr. Reeves?" Marcus asked, suddenly, unsure how to begin this conversation. "Yes," she replied cautiously, clearly not recognizing him. "My name is Captain Marcus Thornfield. I serve with the Royal Guard at the palace. I wonder if I might speak with you about a medical matter involving the royal family?" The color immediately drained from Dr. Reeves' face, and her hand tightened on the doorframe for support. For a moment, Marcus thought she might collapse, but she steadied herself and looked quickly past him to see if anyone else was nearby. "I'm retired," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't discuss my former patients with anyone. Dr. Reeves, I believe you may be in danger. I have information that suggests someone is trying to eliminate evidence and witnesses related to events that occurred at St. Mary's Hospital 25 years ago." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Reeves stepped back from the door as if she had been struck, her face going completely white. She stared at Marcus for several long moments, then quickly looked up and down the street before stepping aside to let him enter. "Come in," she said urgently. "Quickly." The interior of the cottage was as tidy as the exterior, with comfortable furniture arranged around a small fireplace and bookshelves filled with medical journals and novels. Dr. Reeves led him to the sitting room but remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "No one sent me," Marcus replied, pulling out Queen Isabella's letter. "But I think you need to see this." Dr. Reeves took the letter with trembling hands and read it slowly, her expression growing more troubled with each line. When she finished, she sank into an armchair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "Dear God," she whispered. She kept written records. After all these years, after all the promises that nothing would ever be documented. "Dr. Reeves, I need you to tell me what really happened at the hospital the night Prince Alexander was born." The elderly physician looked up at him with eyes that held decades of guilt and fear. "You don't understand what you're asking. The people involved in this, they've already proven they're willing to do terrible things to protect this secret." "What do you mean?" Dr. Reeves stood up and walked to her kitchen, returning with a newspaper clipping from 5 years earlier. The headline read, "Local farmer dies in tragic accident." Below it was a photo of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Thomas Miller. "This wasn't an accident," she said quietly. Thomas had started asking questions about his family history. His adoptive parents had died the year before, and he was going through their papers when he found some inconsistencies in his birth records. He contacted me, wanting to know if I remembered anything about his birth. Marcus felt a chill run through him as he studied the photo. The young man in the picture bore a striking resemblance to the current king, the same strong jawline, the same distinctive nose, the same intelligent eyes that appeared in portraits of Valdorian monarchs going back generations. He was the real prince, Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. Dr. Reeves nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "And 3 weeks after he contacted me, he died in what the police called an equipment malfunction at his farm. A tractor rollover in broad daylight on flat ground, with no witnesses." "You think someone killed him?" "I know someone killed him," she replied firmly. "Because 2 days after his death, I received a visit from a man who claimed to work for palace security. He made it very clear that I should forget Thomas Miller ever existed, and that any medical records related to unusual births at St. Mary's Hospital had been permanently sealed for national security reasons." Marcus sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the full scope of the conspiracy beginning to crystallize in his mind. "Tell me everything that happened the night Prince Alexander was born." Dr. Reeves was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at her garden as if drawing strength from the peaceful scene beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 25 years of suppressed guilt. "It was a difficult birth," she began. "Queen Isabella had been in labor for over 18 hours, and there were complications that required emergency intervention. At the same time, we had another patient in the next room, a young woman named Mary Miller who was having her first child. She was a farmer's wife from about 50 miles outside the capital, and she had come to our hospital because of insurance complications with her local facility. Dr. Reeves paused, her hands wringing together as she relived the memories. Both women delivered within minutes of each other. The babies were brought to the nursery for standard procedures, cleaning, measuring, initial examinations. Both boys, both healthy, both approximately the same size and weight. And then, what happened? The night nurse made a mistake, Dr. Reeves said, her voice barely audible. The identity bracelets were switched. It was a simple error, the kind that happens occasionally in any hospital, but usually it's caught within minutes during routine checks. Marcus leaned forward. But it wasn't caught this time? No, because Queen Isabella began hemorrhaging shortly after delivery. All attention turned to saving her life, and the babies were left in the nursery longer than usual. By the time the medical emergency was over and we returned to check on the infants, the night nurse had gone off duty. She didn't realize her mistake until the next morning. Dr. Reeves stood up and walked to her bookshelf, pulling out a medical journal from 25 years ago. Hidden between its pages was a faded photograph, two newborn babies lying side by side, both wearing hospital identification bracelets. I took this picture for the hospital records, she said, handing the photo to Marcus. Look closely at their faces. Marcus studied the photograph carefully. Both babies looked like typical newborns, but, even in the grainy image, he could see subtle differences. One child had the fine features and slightly pointed chin that characterized Queen Isabella's family, while the other had the stronger bone structure that was typical of the royal bloodline. The baby on the left is wearing the bracelet that says Prince Alexander, Dr. Reeves explained. But, if you compare his features to both parents, it's clear that he belongs with the Miller family. The baby on the right, wearing the Miller identification, has the unmistakable features of the royal lineage. So what did you do when you realized the mistake? Dr. Reeves sat back down, her composure finally beginning to crack. I panicked. The implications were enormous, not just for the families involved, but for the entire kingdom. The succession to the throne depended on that child, and if word got out that there had been a mix-up. You contacted Queen Isabella? Not immediately. First, I spent days researching precedent, looking for guidance on how such a situation should be handled. But there was no precedent, nothing like this had ever happened to a royal birth in recorded history. Dr. Reeves explained how she had finally approached Queen Isabella a week after the birth, expecting the queen consort to demand immediate correction of the error. Instead, Isabella's reaction had been completely unexpected. She didn't want to switch them back, Dr. Reeves said. She had already bonded with the baby she believed was her son, and she was terrified of the scandal that would result if the truth came out. She also pointed out that the Miller family had bonded with their child as well, and that correcting the mistake would traumatize everyone involved. But surely the right thing to do was to return each child to their biological parents? That's what I argued initially, Dr. Reeves replied. But Queen Isabella was persuasive. She pointed out that both children would be loved and cared for, that the Miller boy would have a simple, peaceful life in the countryside, while their biological son would carry the burden of eventually ruling a kingdom. She asked if it might not be a kindness to spare him that responsibility. Marcus tried to imagine the ethical dilemma Dr. Reeves had faced. As a medical professional, she was bound by principles of honesty and patient care. But she was also dealing with circumstances that could affect an entire nation's stability. She also made it clear, Dr. Reeves continued, that my career and reputation would be destroyed if word of the mix-up ever became public. Medical malpractice on that scale, involving the royal family, would have meant the end of everything I had worked for. So you agreed to keep the secret? I convinced myself that I was acting in everyone's best interests, Dr. Reeves said, her voice full of regret. Both children would be loved, both would have good lives, and the kingdom would be spared a constitutional crisis. It seemed like the least harmful solution to an impossible situation. Dr. Reeves went on to describe how she and Queen Isabella had worked together to eliminate any evidence of the mix-up. Hospital records were altered, staff members who had been present that night were transferred to other facilities or convinced to sign confidentiality agreements, and the few remaining documents were secured in palace files that would never be accessed without royal authorization. For 20 years, I told myself that we had made the right choice, Dr. Reeves continued. Both boys grew up happy and healthy. Alexander became a confident, capable young man who seemed well suited for his future role, while Thomas lived a peaceful life with loving adoptive parents. But something changed? Dr. Reeves nodded sadly. As Thomas grew older, people in his community began commenting on his resemblance to the royal family. It was just idle gossip at first, but when he reached adulthood, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. He looked more like King Edward than Alexander ever did. She explained how Thomas had initially dismissed the comments as coincidence, but, after his adoptive parents died and he began going through their papers, he found inconsistencies in his birth records that prompted him to investigate further. He was a smart young man, Dr. Reeves said. He noticed that his blood type didn't match either of his adoptive parents, and that some of the dates on his documents didn't align properly. When he contacted me, I tried to discourage his questions, but he was persistent. And that's when Queen Isabella decided he was becoming a threat? I don't know if Queen Isabella was directly involved in what happened to Thomas, Dr. Reeves said carefully. But I do know that after he contacted me, I was visited by people who made it clear that the matter needed to be resolved permanently. Dr. Reeves described the intimidation she had faced after Thomas Miller's death, subtle threats about her personal safety, reminders about confidentiality agreements she had signed decades earlier, and warnings about what could happen to people who betrayed royal secrets. They also made it clear that if I ever tried to reveal the truth, I would be portrayed as a delusional old woman trying to damage the monarchy with false claims. Who would believe that such an enormous secret could be kept for 25 years? As Marcus listened to Dr. Reeves' account, he realized that the situation was even more complex and dangerous than Queen Isabella's letter had suggested. This wasn't just about a birth mix-up that had been covered up, it was about an ongoing conspiracy that had potentially involved murder to protect its secrecy. Dr. Reeves, do you still have any evidence that could prove what really happened? She looked at him for a long moment before walking back to her bookshelf. From behind another medical journal, she pulled out a manila envelope that had clearly been hidden there for many years. I kept copies of the original hospital records before they were altered, she said. Blood type documentation, footprints, initial medical assessments, everything that would prove which baby belonged with which family. I told myself I was keeping them in case the truth ever needed to come out to prevent some greater harm. Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized the significance of what she was offering. This evidence could prove that Prince Alexander is not the rightful heir to the throne? Beyond any doubt, Dr. Reeves confirmed. It would also prove that Thomas Miller was the true prince, and that his death prevented him from ever learning his real identity. As she handed him the envelope, Marcus understood that he was now in possession of evidence that could fundamentally alter the course of history. But he also realized that possessing this evidence made him an even greater threat to the people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secret. Dr. Reeves, you need to leave here immediately, Marcus said urgently. If Queen Isabella realizes that her letter is missing, she'll know that someone is investigating the truth. You could be in serious danger. The elderly physician smiled sadly. I've been living with that danger for 25 years. At my age, the thought of finally telling the truth is almost a relief. But if something happens to you, this evidence might never see the light of day. Dr. Reeves considered this for a moment, then walked to her desk and quickly wrote something on a piece of paper. This is the name and address of my lawyer, she said, handing him the note. I'm going to contact him immediately and arrange for copies of all this evidence to be placed in a safety deposit box with instructions for release if anything happens to me. As Marcus prepared to leave Dr. Reeves' cottage, carrying both Queen Isabella's letter and the original hospital records, he knew that the conspiracy was about to enter a new phase. The evidence was no longer just suggestive, it was conclusive. Prince Alexander was not the rightful heir to the throne, Thomas Miller had been murdered to prevent the truth from emerging, and a small group of people had successfully maintained this secret for a quarter of a century. But Marcus also knew that possessing this evidence put both him and Dr. Reeves in immediate danger. The people who had killed Thomas Miller would not hesitate to eliminate two more threats to their secret, especially now that conclusive proof of the conspiracy existed. As he drove back toward the capital city, Marcus realized that he could no longer handle this situation alone. The evidence was too important and too dangerous to trust to a single person. He needed to find someone in a position of authority who could ensure that the truth came to light while protecting the innocent people who might be caught in the aftermath. The question was, who could he trust with information that could destroy the monarchy and potentially cost lives in the process? Marcus knew he needed help, but choosing the right person to trust with information this explosive required careful consideration. His first instinct was to approach someone within the palace security hierarchy, but Captain General Morrison's reaction to the missing documents suggested that the conspiracy might reach deeper into the palace administration than Marcus had initially realized. After much deliberation, Marcus decided to contact Lady Catherine Blackwood, Prince Alexander's fiancée. As someone who was about to marry into the royal family, she had both a personal stake in the truth and the social standing necessary to ensure that any revelations would be handled properly. More importantly, she was not yet officially part of the royal family, which meant she might be more objective about evidence that challenged their legitimacy. Lady Catherine came from one of Valdoria's oldest noble families, with a reputation for integrity and social justice that had earned her widespread public respect. She served on several charitable boards and had been instrumental in reforming the kingdom's adoption laws, experience that might help her understand the ethical complexities of the situation Marcus was about to present. Arranging a private meeting with Lady Catherine required careful planning. As Prince Alexander's fiancée, her schedule was heavily monitored, and any unusual meetings would likely attract attention from palace security. Marcus decided to use the public areas of the palace to his advantage, timing his approach for when she would be attending one of her regular charity meetings in the palace conference center. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and Marcus spent the intervening days making copies of all the evidence and securing the originals in a safety deposit box at a bank outside the capital city. He also prepared a detailed written summary of everything he had learned, including timelines, key players, and supporting documentation. On Thursday morning, Marcus received troubling news that confirmed his worst fears about the dangers surrounding this conspiracy. Dr. Margaret Reeves had been found dead in her cottage, apparently the victim of a heart attack that had occurred sometime during the night. The local authorities saw nothing suspicious about the death of a 73-year-old woman with a history of cardiovascular issues, but the timing sent chills through Marcus. He immediately called the lawyer whose name Dr. Reeves had given him, only to learn that the elderly physician had never contacted him about placing any documents in a safety deposit box. Either she had changed her mind about creating the backup evidence, or she had been prevented from doing so by the people who had killed her. The news of Dr. Reeves' death fundamentally changed the stakes of Marcus's investigation. He was now the only living person outside the conspiracy who possessed definitive proof of what had happened 25 years ago. The hospital records she had given him were irreplaceable evidence that could never be reconstructed, making him both invaluable and extremely dangerous to the people trying to protect their secret. Despite his growing fear, Marcus proceeded with his plan to meet Lady Catherine. The charity meeting was being held in one of the palace's smaller conference rooms, and Marcus was able to position himself nearby under the pretense of conducting routine security checks. Lady Catherine arrived precisely on time, looking every inch the future queen in an elegant navy blue dress and simple pearl jewelry. She greeted the other committee members warmly, displaying the kind of genuine interest in their work that had made her popular with both the public and the charitable organizations she supported. Marcus waited until the meeting was breaking up for a coffee break before approaching her. "Lady Catherine? I'm Captain Thornfield with Palace Security. I wonder if I might have a private word with you about a security matter related to your upcoming wedding?" She looked slightly surprised but nodded graciously. "Of course, Captain. Shall we step into the adjacent room?" The adjacent room was a small library that was rarely used during the day, providing the privacy Marcus needed for such a sensitive conversation. Lady Catherine seated herself in one of the leather chairs near the window, her posture attentive but relaxed. "Lady Catherine, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear and even more difficult to believe," Marcus began. "It concerns Prince Alexander's legitimacy as heir to the throne." The color drained from her face immediately, but she maintained her composure with the kind of trained self-control that came from a lifetime of public appearances. I'm sorry, what did you say? Marcus pulled out the folder containing copies of all the evidence and handed it to her. 3 days ago, I discovered a letter written by Queen Isabella that reveals Prince Alexander is not King Edward's biological son. He was switched at birth with another baby, and the true heir died 5 years ago without ever knowing his real identity. Lady Catherine opened the folder with trembling hands and began reading Queen Isabella's letter. As she progressed through the document, her face went through a range of emotions: disbelief, shock, anger, and, finally, a kind of resigned sadness that suggested she was beginning to accept the terrible truth. "This can't be real," she whispered when she finished reading. "There has to be some explanation, some misunderstanding." Marcus then showed her the hospital records Dr. Reeves had preserved, explaining how the birth mix-up had occurred and how the conspiracy to conceal it had been maintained for 25 years. He also told her about Dr. Reeves' death the previous night, and his suspicion that she had been murdered to prevent her from providing testimony about the events at St. Mary's Hospital. Lady Catherine studied each document carefully, her legal training evident in the methodical way she examined the evidence. She asked pointed questions about the chain of custody for the documents, the credibility of Dr. Reeves, and the potential for the evidence to have been fabricated. "Assuming this is all true," she said finally, "what do you expect me to do with this information?" "I need someone I can trust to ensure that the truth comes to light in a way that doesn't destroy innocent people," Marcus replied. "Prince Alexander has no idea that his entire life is built on a lie. The kingdom deserves to know that their future king is not actually royalty, but Alexander also deserves to learn the truth in a way that doesn't completely destroy him." Lady Catherine set down the documents and walked to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where she and Prince Alexander had spent many happy hours discussing their future together. "If this is true," she said quietly, "then my engagement to Alexander is based on a complete fraud. I'm not marrying the future king of Valdoria, I'm marrying a commoner who has been unknowingly living someone else's life." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, understanding how devastating this revelation must be for her personally. "Don't apologize," she replied, turning back to face him. "If this is the truth, then I'm grateful you've brought it to me before the wedding rather than after. But I need to understand what you think should happen next." Marcus had been wrestling with that question for days. "The evidence is conclusive, and people have already died to keep this secret. We can't simply ignore it and hope it goes away. But we also can't release it publicly without careful consideration of the consequences." Lady Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "A revelation like this could destabilize the entire government. Valdoria's constitution is built around the concept of hereditary monarchy, and if the heir is illegitimate, it raises questions about the validity of every law and treaty signed in the royal family's name. There's also the question of what happens to the succession," Marcus added. "Thomas Miller was the true heir, but he's dead. The next in line would be King Edward's younger brother, Prince James, but he renounced his claim to the throne 30 years ago when he married a commoner and moved to Australia." Lady Catherine began pacing the small room, her legal mind working through the complexities of the situation. "We need to involve people with both the authority and the integrity to handle this properly," she said. "But we also need to protect ourselves and anyone else who might be in danger because of what they know." "Who did you have in mind?" "Chief Justice Margaret Williams," Lady Catherine replied without hesitation. "She's served on the Supreme Court for 20 years and has a reputation for absolute integrity. More importantly, she's one of the few people in the kingdom with both the legal authority and the moral courage to handle a constitutional crisis of this magnitude." Marcus felt a sense of relief at hearing a concrete plan beginning to emerge. Chief Justice Williams was indeed known for her uncompromising ethics and her ability to navigate complex legal situations with wisdom and fairness. "But before we approach Justice Williams," Lady Catherine continued, "I think we need to confront Prince Alexander directly. He deserves to hear this from people who care about him rather than learning about it through legal proceedings or media coverage." The thought of telling Prince Alexander that his entire identity was false seemed almost impossibly cruel, but Marcus knew Lady Catherine was right. "When do you think we should approach him?" "Tonight," she said firmly. "The longer we wait, the more likely it becomes that Queen Isabella will realize the evidence is missing and take action to protect herself. We also need to consider the possibility that other people involved in the conspiracy might try to eliminate us before we can reveal the truth. Lady Catherine arranged for a private dinner with Prince Alexander that evening, ostensibly to discuss wedding details but actually to provide the setting for the most difficult conversation of his life. She also contacted Chief Justice Williams and requested an emergency meeting for the following morning, citing matters of national security that require immediate judicial oversight. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself watching the palace staff and security personnel with new suspicion, wondering who else might be involved in the conspiracy and who might be watching his movements. The paranoia was exhausting, but Dr. Reeves' death had made it clear that the stakes were literally life and death. That evening, Marcus positioned himself outside the private dining room where Lady Catherine was meeting with Prince Alexander. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see through the partially open door as Lady Catherine presented the evidence to her fiancé. Prince Alexander's reaction was everything Marcus had feared it would be. The confident, composed young man who had been raised to rule a kingdom seemed to physically shrink as he read the documents that revealed the truth about his identity. His face cycled through disbelief, anger, and devastating sadness as the full implications of the conspiracy became clear. At one point, Prince Alexander stood up abruptly and began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of complete despair. Marcus could see him asking questions, probably demanding to know how such an enormous deception could have been maintained for so long, and who else knew about the conspiracy. The conversation lasted for over 2 hours, and, when it finally ended, both Prince Alexander and Lady Catherine looked emotionally exhausted. As they prepared to leave the dining room, Prince Alexander noticed Marcus standing nearby and approached him directly. "Captain Thornfield," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Catherine tells me you're the one who discovered this evidence." "Yes, Your Highness," Marcus replied, unsure how to address someone whose royal title might no longer be legitimate. "I want you to know that I'm grateful," Prince Alexander continued. "Learning this truth is devastating, but living a lie for the rest of my life would have been worse. Whatever happens next, I'm glad that someone with integrity was willing to bring this forward." As Marcus watched Prince Alexander walk away, shoulders slumped with the weight of his new knowledge, he reflected on how completely the young man's life had been changed by a single piece of paper that had blown across a marble floor 3 nights ago. But he also knew that the most dangerous part of this crisis was yet to come. Queen Isabella still didn't know that her secret was exposed, Chief Justice Williams still needed to be briefed on the evidence, and the constitutional implications of the revelation still needed to be addressed. Most importantly, the people who had maintained this conspiracy for 25 years and had already killed at least 2 people to protect it were still free and still dangerous. As news of the evening's revelations spread through the small circle of people now aware of the truth, Marcus knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether more innocent people would die to preserve a lie that could no longer be hidden. The emergency meeting with Chief Justice Margaret Williams took place at dawn in her private chambers, away from the prying eyes of palace staff and media. Justice Williams was a woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of penetrating intelligence that had made her one of the most respected legal minds in Valdoria's history. Marcus, Lady Catherine, and Prince Alexander presented their evidence methodically, with Justice Williams asking detailed questions about the authenticity of the documents, the credibility of the sources, and the legal implications of what they were revealing. Her poker face gave no indication of her thoughts as she examined each piece of evidence, but Marcus could see the gravity of the situation registering in her careful attention to every detail. "This is the most serious constitutional crisis in our nation's history," Justice Williams said finally. "If this evidence is authentic, and preliminary examination suggests it is, then we're dealing with fraud on a scale that could fundamentally undermine the legitimacy of our government." She explained that the situation required immediate action on multiple fronts, securing additional evidence before it could be destroyed, protecting witnesses from potential retaliation, and developing a plan for revealing the truth that would minimize chaos and preserve democratic institutions. "However," she continued, looking directly at Prince Alexander, "we also need to consider the human cost of this revelation. You've lived your entire life believing you were destined to rule, and now you're learning that your identity is based on a lie. The kingdom also needs stability during this transition, regardless of how we ultimately resolve the succession question." Prince Alexander, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke. Justice Williams, I want the truth to come out, regardless of what it costs me personally. The people of Valdoria deserve to know that their government is legitimate, and they can't have that assurance while this conspiracy continues. His words impressed Marcus, who could see that despite the devastating blow to his identity, Prince Alexander was putting the kingdom's interests ahead of his own. It was exactly the kind of character that would have made him a good king, which made the tragedy of his situation even more poignant. Justice Williams outlined her plan for the next phase of the investigation. A special prosecutor would be appointed to investigate the conspiracy and gather additional evidence, while a constitutional commission would be formed to address the legal questions surrounding the succession. Most importantly, Queen Isabella and any other conspirators would be arrested immediately to prevent them from destroying more evidence or harming additional witnesses. Captain Thornfield, Justice Williams said, I'm placing you under protective custody until this matter is resolved. The people who killed Dr. Reeves and Thomas Miller will certainly view you as their primary threat now. The protective custody was a relief, but Marcus was also concerned about his family's safety. Justice Williams assured him that Sarah and Emma would be protected as well, with a security detail assigned to watch their cottage around the clock. As they prepared to leave Justice Williams' chambers, Prince Alexander made a request that surprised everyone. I want to confront Queen Isabella myself before she's arrested. She's the only mother I've ever known, despite everything that's happened, and I think I deserve answers about why she chose to maintain this deception for so long. Justice Williams initially objected, citing security concerns, but Prince Alexander was adamant. She's not going to physically harm me, he argued. Whatever else she's done, Isabella genuinely cares about me as a person. I need to understand her motivations before this becomes a legal proceeding that focuses only on crimes and punishments. A compromise was reached. Prince Alexander would meet with Queen Isabella in the palace library, a public area that could be monitored by security personnel. Justice Williams would coordinate the timing so that police would be standing by to arrest Isabella immediately after the conversation ended. The confrontation between Prince Alexander and Queen Isabella took place 2 hours later, with Marcus observing from a concealed position nearby. Isabella entered the library expecting a routine conversation with her stepson, but her expression changed immediately when she saw the documents spread across the table and the grim expression on Prince Alexander's face. Alexander, she said cautiously. What's all this about? I know the truth, Isabella, he said quietly, using her first name instead of the maternal title he had always called her before. I know about the mix-up at the hospital, about Thomas Miller, about the 25-year conspiracy to hide my real identity. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Isabella's carefully maintained composure crumbled completely, and she seemed to age 10 years in the span of a few seconds. She sank into a chair across from Prince Alexander, her hands trembling as she stared at the evidence that proved her deepest secret had finally been exposed. How long have you known? She whispered. 3 days, Alexander replied. Long enough to understand the scope of what you've done, but not long enough to understand why. Isabella was quiet for several minutes, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find words to explain decades of deception. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken and filled with regret. I never intended for it to go this far, she began. When Dr. Reeves first told me about the mix-up, I thought we could fix it quietly, switch you back with minimal disruption to anyone's life. But you were already bonding with your father, already becoming part of our family, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. She described the impossible position she had found herself in as a new mother dealing with unprecedented circumstances. The Miller family was so happy with their baby, and you were clearly thriving in the palace environment. It seemed cruel to traumatize 4 people to correct what was essentially a paperwork error. But it wasn't just a paperwork error, Alexander said, his voice rising. It was my entire identity. It was Thomas Miller's birthright. It was the foundation of the monarchy's legitimacy. Isabella nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. I told myself that both children would be loved and cared for, that the details of biology mattered less than the reality of the families who were raising them. But, as the years passed, it became impossible to reverse the decision without destroying everything we had built. She explained how the secret had consumed her life, creating constant anxiety about discovery and forcing her to make increasingly desperate choices to protect the conspiracy. Every public appearance, every official ceremony, every time someone commented on family resemblances, I lived in terror that someone would piece together the truth.
So you had Thomas killed when he started asking questions? Isabella's face went white at the accusation.
No, she said firmly. I never authorized violence against anyone. When Thomas contacted Dr. Reeves, I panicked and reached out to some people who promised they could handle the situation discreetly. I thought they were going to offer him money to stop asking questions, or maybe relocate him to another country.
I never imagined they would.
Her voice trailed off as she realized how naive she had been to trust others with such a dangerous secret. When I learned what had happened to Thomas, I was horrified. But, by then, I was in too deep to confess without implicating myself in his death. Prince Alexander listened to Isabella's explanation with a mixture of anger and sadness. Dr. Reeves died 3 days ago, he said quietly.
Did you have anything to do with that?
No, Isabella replied, but her answer was less convincing this time. But I can't deny that I was relieved when I learned of her death. She was the only remaining witness who could have provided testimony about what really happened. As their conversation continued, Marcus could see that Prince Alexander was struggling to reconcile the woman who had raised him with the person who had participated in such an elaborate deception. Despite everything Isabella had done, it was clear that she genuinely loved him as a son, which made the betrayal even more painful. The meeting ended when Justice Williams signaled that police were ready to make the arrest.
Prince Alexander stood up and looked down at Isabella with a mixture of pity and disappointment.
I want you to know that despite everything that's happened, I'm grateful for the love and care you gave me for 25 years, he said. But I also want you to understand that I can never forgive you for robbing Thomas Miller of his birthright and his life. Isabella was arrested quietly and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The arrest was kept secret for 24 hours while Justice Williams coordinated with government officials to prepare for the public revelation of the scandal. The announcement to the kingdom was made by Justice Williams herself in a televised address that explained the basic facts of the case while promising a full investigation and appropriate constitutional reforms. The reaction was immediate and intense: shock, anger, calls for the abolition of the monarchy, and demands for justice against everyone involved in the conspiracy.
Prince Alexander addressed the nation later that same day, announcing his intention to renounce any claim to the throne and support whatever constitutional changes were deemed necessary to restore the government's legitimacy.
His dignity and grace in the face of personal devastation earned him widespread respect, even from those who were angry about the conspiracy. The Constitutional Commission ultimately recommended a transition to a constitutional republic, with an elected president replacing the hereditary monarchy. The transition process took 2 years to complete, during which Prince Alexander worked closely with democratic reformers to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. Marcus was awarded the kingdom's highest civilian honor for his role in exposing the conspiracy, but he found little satisfaction in the recognition. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy reached deeper than anyone had initially suspected, involving palace officials, medical personnel, and government administrators who had helped maintain the deception over the decades. Dr. Reeves' death was eventually ruled a homicide, but the people responsible were never identified or prosecuted. The official investigation suggested that foreign intelligence services might have been involved in silencing witnesses, but no definitive evidence was ever found. The Miller family farm was turned into a memorial for Thomas Miller, with a plaque acknowledging him as the true heir who never knew his heritage. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand the human cost of the conspiracy and the importance of truth in democratic society. Queen Isabella was convicted of conspiracy and fraud but received a relatively light sentence due to her cooperation with investigators and her lack of direct involvement in the murders. She served 3 years in a minimum security facility before being released to live quietly in exile outside the kingdom. Prince Alexander, who legally changed his name back to his birth name of David Miller, became an advocate for government transparency and constitutional reform. He married Lady Catherine in a simple ceremony after the monarchy was abolished, and they devoted their lives to charitable work and democratic education. Marcus remained with the security service during the transition to a republic, eventually rising to head the agency responsible for protecting elected officials. The experience of uncovering the royal conspiracy had taught him